My name is Gurma. Before any of this, I was nobody worth remembering. A farmer's son from the hills outside Harar, in the east of Ethiopia. I knew how to plow a field, how to argue with a mule, and how to keep my mouth shut around men older than me. That was the whole of my education. Harar in those days was a walled city, red stone and narrow streets, full of coffee traders and spice sellers and soldiers who belonged to Ras Makonnen. Everybody in that region belongs to Ras Makonnen, one way or another. He governed the whole province in the name of the emperor, Menelik II, and men said he'd never lost a battle in his life. I used to see his riders pass through the market on their way somewhere important, and I never once imagined I'd be marching behind one of them. I cared about the harvest, and about a girl 2 farms over who wouldn't look at me. Then the recruiters came through, and everything I cared about got smaller. Here's what they told us, and it was true. Years before, our emperor signed a treaty with the Italians. 2 versions of that treaty existed, one in Amharic, one in Italian. The Amharic version said Ethiopia could ask Italy for help with foreign affairs if it wanted to. The Italian version said Ethiopia had to go through Italy for everything, like a colony, not a kingdom. Menelik found out about the trick and tore the whole agreement apart in public. The Italians didn't accept that answer. They kept pushing south from their coastal colony, taking land, building forts on ground that wasn't theirs, and putting down anyone who fought them for it. That was the short version. The long version was written by men in offices in Rome and Addis Ababa. I only knew the short version, and it was enough. Menelik called every governor in the empire to bring men north. Ras Makonnen answered first, the way he answered everything, fast and without waiting to be asked twice. I was 17. My father gave me his old rifle, one he'd bought off a trader years back. A heavy single-shot thing that kicked like an angry ox, and told me not to lose it, because it cost more than our whole harvest. My mother didn't say anything. She just held my face in her 2 hands for longer than she needed to, and then let go. There were maybe 30 of us from our stretch of hills who went that week. Some went because Ras Makonnen called them by name. Some went because staying home while your neighbors marched was its own kind of shame. I went for both reasons, if I'm honest. And a third one, too. I was 17, and I wanted to know what the rest of the world looked like past the edge of our fields. One of those 30 was a boy named Tesfaye, who'd grown up 2 houses from mine and could talk more in an hour than I could in a week. He decided somewhere along the march that we were brothers now, whether I agreed to it or not, and I didn't mind. Not one bit. It kept the road from feeling like what it actually was. We marched north in December, thousands of us, from every corner Ras Makonnen's writ ran. Farmers, herders, a few professional soldiers who'd fought before and said very little about it. I remember looking back once at the hills around Harar and thinking I might be looking at them for the last time. I was right about that more than I knew. I never farmed again after that winter, not once. We didn't march straight into the big battle. Nobody does in a real war. First, there was Amba Alagi, a mountain post the Italians held with a small garrison, mostly local troops fighting for Italian pay under an Italian officer named Toselli. Ras Makonnen didn't send us in blind. He sent men to hit their side flank first, wear them down, pull their attention one way. I was in the second wave, further back, close enough to hear it, but not close enough to see faces. That's a particular kind of terror. Hearing gunfire and not knowing yet if it's going well or badly. You stand there gripping a rifle you've never fired at a person, listening to noise that could mean your side is winning or your side is being wiped off the mountain. And there's no way to tell which from where you're standing. It went badly for them. The Italian flank buckled. Toselli pulled men back to save what he could, and that's exactly the moment Ras Makonnen had been waiting for. He'd already put a force across the retreat road, out of sight, patient. When Toselli's column came down that road thinking they were escaping, our men were already standing in it. I fired my rifle for the first time in my life that day. I couldn't tell you if I hit anything. The noise alone was enough to make you forget your own name. Men shouting orders in 3 directions at once, animals screaming, smoke thick enough that you fired at movement and hoped. What I remember clearer is afterward. Walking the ground, seeing how few of us it had cost compared to what it cost them. Toseli didn't survive it. Most of his command didn't. Older men around the fire that night weren't celebrating, not really. One of them, a man named Wolde, who'd fought in wars before I was born, told me something I didn't understand yet. He said, "This was the small one. Wait until Menelik and the Italians decide the big one has to happen." I asked him how he knew there'd be a big one. He looked at me like I'd asked why the sun comes up. "Of course there'll be a big one," he said. "Neither side can walk away now. Rome's already humiliated once. They won't stop here." He was right about the humiliation, at least. Word came weeks later that leaders back in Rome were furious, that the loss at Amba Alagi had shaken their government, and that they were pouring more men and money into the colony to answer for it. And word came, too, that the emperor himself was marching north with the main army, and every regional force, ours included, was to fall in behind him and hold position near a town called Adwa. I didn't know the name yet. Nobody outside that province did. That was about to change. Before we go further, if you'd been 17 and handed a rifle that cost your family's whole harvest, would you have marched? Or would you have found a reason to stay home? Tell me honestly in the comments. What people don't understand about a war like this one is how much of it is waiting, and how much waiting can wear a man down faster than fighting does. We camped in the highlands near Adwa for weeks. Tens of thousands of us, more men and animals than that dry season's ground could easily feed. The Italians camped not far off, under their general, Baratieri, and they had the same problem we did, maybe worse, because their supply lines stretched back to the coast, long and thin and easy to cut. And someone was cutting them. Empress Tetu, Menelik's wife, and nobody's idea of a woman who stayed behind the tent flap, commanded her own force in that camp, several thousand strong. She used them to choke off the wells and the mountain passes the Italians needed for water and supply. I saw her once, from a distance, on horseback, giving orders to men twice her size who didn't argue with her. The Italians called it starving them out. We called it doing what generals do. I never understood why they thought that should insult us. Food got short on our side too, I won't pretend otherwise. There were nights I went to sleep hungry and woke up hungrier, chewing on nothing, trying to save what grain I had for the next day I couldn't predict. Some units were already talking about heading home if nothing happened soon. Because an army that big can't live off a stretch of highland forever, no matter how many wells the Empress's men were holding for us instead of them. I think the Italian general knew our weakness as well as we knew his. I think that's exactly why he waited as long as he could. He was hoping we'd break apart on our own, save him the trouble of a battle he wasn't sure he'd win. Tesfaye, who never stops talking even with an empty stomach, used to joke that we'd win this war by simply outlasting everyone's patience, ours included. Neither side moves, everyone starves a little, and eventually the last man standing gets to call it a victory. I told him that wasn't how wars worked. He said maybe not, but it was how this one was starting to feel. Camped on a hillside, eating less every week, while 2 armies stared at each other and waited for someone else to make the first mistake. But Rome didn't have that kind of patience. Word reached our camp, the way word always reaches a camp, half from spies and half from rumor. And this time it turned out to be close to true, that the Italian government back home was sending furious telegrams, demanding a victory, all but accusing their own general of cowardice for waiting. There was even talk that Rome had already chosen a replacement general to send out and take his command away from him. And that news alone was enough to push a proud man into a decision a patient man wouldn't have made. We heard other things too, sitting around those fires. that Menelik had more rifles at his back than any Ethiopian army in memory, close to 100,000 modern breech loaders bought over the years from half of Europe. Some of them ironically sold to us by the Italians themselves before relations soured. My father's old single-shot gun looked like a museum piece next to what some of the better supplied units carried. Ras Makonnen himself had spent years building trade routes through Harar just to keep weapons flowing north for exactly this kind of day. Whatever the Italians expected to find in these hills, it wasn't an army this well armed. And I think that surprise cost them before a single shot was fired. On the night of the 29th of February, our scouts came in fast. The Italians were moving, all of them, in the dark, toward our positions. Wolde, the old soldier from Amba Alagi, found me checking my rifle for the third time that hour. He didn't tell me to be brave. He said, "Sleep if you can, because tomorrow won't give you the chance." I didn't sleep. I don't think many of us did. I remember lying there, listening to the camp breathe around me. Thousands of men trying to be quiet, and none of them managing it completely. And thinking about the girl back home, who still hadn't agreed to look at me. Wondering if I'd ever get the chance to find out if that would change. Here's the part the Italians got wrong, and it decided everything. They moved 3 columns forward in the dark, meaning to be dug into strong ground by sunrise, ready to force our hand either into attacking their prepared position or pulling back entirely. But the ground around Adwa is brutal, steep, broken, full of ridgelines that look nothing alike in the dark and everything alike in a fog. Their maps, we learned later, were bad. Some of the peaks weren't even where the maps said they were. And a march that should have taken hours in daylight turned into a slow, confused crawl through terrain none of those officers had walked before. One column, under an officer named Albertone, got turned around in that broken ground and ended up marching further forward than any of them intended, right up against our main position, in the gray hour before real daylight, with no idea how close they'd come. I heard later, from men who'd been closer to the front of our line than I was, that some of Albertone's officers realized the mistake before the general did and argued for pulling back before it was too late. By the time anyone with the authority to give that order actually gave it, the column was already close enough that pulling back wasn't a real option anymore. That's the thing about a mistake made in the dark. By the time you can see it clearly, you're usually already standing inside it. I was in the line that met them. I won't make it sound cleaner than it was. It was chaos before it was anything else. Shouting in 3 or 4 languages, animals screaming, men firing at shapes because the light wasn't good enough for faces yet. Somewhere off to my right, a unit of our riflemen was already pouring fire into ground the Italians hadn't expected to be defended at all. I remember the man beside me, older than my father, calmly reloading like he was shelling grain, while I fumbled my second shot so badly I nearly dropped the rifle in the dirt. But we had the numbers, and we had the ground, and Albertone's column did not have either. Ras Makonnen's forces, and units alongside ours, closed around them like a hand closing around something too small to hold on to. Another Italian commander, a general named Arimondi, tried pushing his own men forward to relieve the pressure, and for a while it held. Long enough that I heard afterwards some of our own officers worried the whole morning might tip back the other way. It didn't. By full light, Albertone's column was finished, broken, scattered, its commander taken prisoner, and Arimondi's relief effort bled out trying to hold ground that couldn't be held. A second Italian column, under an officer named Dabormida, tried to fall back and support the retreat instead of pushing forward into the same trap. Instead, they walked into a narrow valley that turned into a trap of its own. Our cavalry, men with lances, fast over that ground in a way infantry never could be, caught them there and didn't let go. I heard afterward that Dabormida's body was never found. I believe it. That valley swallowed men whole that day, and it kept whatever it swallowed. Somewhere in the middle of it, I lost track of Tesfaye entirely. The The kind of losing track that puts a knot in your chest you don't have time to feel properly until later. It wasn't until the fighting near our position had mostly burned itself out that I found him again, unhurt, sitting on an overturned Italian ammunition crate like it was the most natural seat in the world, telling anyone who'd listen how close a shell had landed to him, and how he was clearly the luckiest man in the Emperor's whole army. Around us, some of our units were already dragging captured artillery pieces off the ridge, guns the Italians hadn't managed to fire even once before the position collapsed under them, still cold, still pointed at nothing. I fired more rounds in those few hours than in the whole rest of my life combined. At some point, my hands were shaking so badly I had to stop and just breathe, crouched behind a rock, while the battle kept going without me for a minute or two. Nobody tells you that part. Nobody tells you there are minutes in a battle where you simply can't anymore. And then you find you can again, because the alternative is worse. Wolde found me there, hauled me up by the collar without a word, and pointed me back toward the line like he was correcting a plow that had drifted off its row. By the middle of the day, it was over. The last Italian formation broke and ran for Eritrea. And what had been a disciplined colonial army that morning was a scattered, desperate column of men trying to survive their own retreat by afternoon, throwing away rifles and packs just to move faster over ground that didn't want to let them go either. I want to ask you something the history books don't usually ask. Everyone remembers the charge, the victory, the numbers. Almost nobody talks about the minute in the middle of it where a soldier just has to stop and breathe before he can keep going. Have you ever had a moment like that? Not on a battlefield, just in your own life, where you had to stop before you could keep going? Tell me in the comments. Afterward, the ground told its own story. And it wasn't a story anyone enjoyed reading. Historians still argue over the exact numbers. Some put Italian dead close to 4,000, others closer to 7. And our own losses were counted in the thousands too, though nobody I ever met agreed on precisely how many. I'm not going to pretend I know the true count. I know what I saw near my own position, and I know it was more than any man should have to walk past in a single morning. What I do know is what happened to the men who surrendered. Hundreds of Italian soldiers were taken prisoner that day, and more over the days that followed. Menelik didn't order them killed, and he didn't let them be mistreated out of revenge, though plenty of men in that camp would have understood if he had. They were marched south and held for the better part of a year. I spoke with one of them myself months later when I was posted near where some of the prisoners were kept. He was young, younger than I expected, barely older than Tesfaye, and he told me, through a trader who spoke both our languages badly enough that half of it probably got lost, that he'd been terrified the day he was captured, certain he'd be killed on the spot the way he'd been told Ethiopians treated prisoners. Instead, he was fed and eventually put to light work, and by the time I met him he'd picked up enough Amharic to argue with the men guarding him about a card game, badly, and lose most of the time. I asked him, through the same tired trader, if he hated us for what happened at Adwa. He thought about it longer than I expected before he answered. He said he hated the officers who'd marched him into those hills at night with bad maps and no real plan for what waited on the other side of them. He didn't have much left over to hate the men who'd been waiting there. I've thought about that answer more than once since. Some of those men wrote afterward, once they were finally released, that the year wasn't cruel. A few even said, strange as it sounds, that they missed Ethiopia once they finally went home. Word of what happened at Adwa reached Rome and shook the government to its foundations. It reached the rest of the world, too, faster than I would have thought possible for a battle fought in hills most Europeans couldn't have found on a map the week before. Later I heard that in Rome itself, crowds gathered in the streets over the news, not to celebrate, and that the government that sent Baratieri and his men into those hills didn't survive the year that followed. For the first time in that whole difficult century, an African army had met a European army in open battle, and beaten it decisively, on ground of its own choosing, with a plan its own commanders had built. There was no explaining that away, no matter how many people in comfortable rooms far from here tried, and plenty of them did try, for years afterward. The road home took weeks, longer than the road out, because nobody marches fast when there's nothing left chasing them. Tesfaye talked the whole way back, too, though quieter than before, and somewhere on that road he stopped joking about outlasting anyone's patience. I think we both understood, without saying it, that we'd walked out as boys and were walking back as something else, and neither of us had words yet for what that something else was. I went home to Harar eventually. I did farm again, in the end. The girl 2 farms over did finally look at me for what that's worth. And I've told this story to our children more times than they probably wanted to hear it. But I was never the same man who left that winter, with his father's rifle, and no idea what a battlefield actually smelled like. Ras Makonnen went on serving the emperor for years after, still the man everyone in Harar swore had never lost a battle. His own son would grow up to rule Ethiopia himself one day, under the name Haile Selassie, though none of us standing in that camp in 1896 had any way of knowing that. We were just trying to survive the morning. I don't tell this story to make myself sound brave. Most of what I did that day was frightened and lucky, and following orders I barely understood in the moment. I tell it because it happened, because I was there, and because for one morning near a small town in the Ethiopian highlands, the world's idea of who could win a war got turned upside down. Look into what happened next for Ethiopia and for the men who fought there. The sources are in the description, with the photographs the historians still argue over.